This water communion ceremony is something that we do every year at Tapestry. I don't know when the ritual began in this congregation, but it certainly predates me. Even though we've already done it, I want to tell you a little bit about the ritual's history. Beyond being a tradition that we do every year, the water communion is a great symbol of who we're called to be as Unitarian Universalists. It's actually a relatively new ritual, at least in the religious time scale, it's new. The first water communion or water ceremony was held in 1980. In the few years prior to that, Unitarian Universalists were engaged in some deep conversations about the way we recognized women, both in our institutions and in our beliefs. In the late 70s, when Unitarians spoke of God, it was almost always speaking of God as He. May He bless us. May He heal us. May He inspire us with His creative powers. Now, as you know, we don't talk about God all that much, but when you only talk about God as masculine, there's a problem. Who was talking about God publicly may have contributed to what they were calling her. As late as 1980, nearly all of the ordained UU clergy were men. Only 5% were women. It's hard to imagine those demographics today. Women today are ordained in equal numbers as men, and the president of our whole association is a woman right now. But 40 years ago, ministry was still definitely an old boys' club. And just as our language for God was limited to masculine pronouns, our language for people was too. You know our 7 principles? Yeah, the version back then used to refer to humanity as all mankind, and a handful of other male-centered pieces of language. Now, I don't want to paint us as the evil machine of patriarchy. The mistakes of sexism that we were making were mostly subtle, and they were a reflection of a much wider culture. But in the late 70s, some courageous women and I hope a few courageous men invited us to begin thinking of better ways of living out our values. Our Unitarian Universalist principles and purposes, at least the version that we know, that our kids know and sing, is to a great degree a product of that moment. Our principles usually get revisited every so often, but it was in that time when we realized how limited the language of mankind was that we created this most recent revision. It was a rich time for us, finding our way, finding better ways of living our values, changing our institutions. We were also growing as people and as communities. It's in that time of discernment that it was decided to have a worship service led by women, not the few ordained clergy women, but lay women, and to invite women from across the country to participate in this Unitarian Universalist gathering. They called it Coming Home, like rivers to the sea. For this first ever water ceremony, the leaders asked 8 women to come from distant places and bring water from their homes. So they brought water from the Rio Grande and water from the rivers of Canada. They brought rainwater from Maryland and water from the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Each of these women poured water into a large earthenware bowl and described in detail what that represented to them. It was a little bit different from what we do with our water. We usually pour water into the bowl and call it a day. But at this first water communion, the women were encouraged to take some home with them. In order to do that, the women were invited to find a small container, likely a cosmetics container, and empty it out. Empty out the makeup, empty out the perfume bottle, empty out the hair product, empty out the bottle of whatever you use to make yourself appear good enough for others, and refill the bottle with this water, a symbol of strength that's manifest in the bonds of community. Now, dumping out your cosmetics is a particular brand of feminism of a particular time, and I'm not going to unpack that symbol. But I wanted to share with you that historical detail because it describes water communion as a serious ritual, a ritual that comes with a little bit of sacrifice and change. The first water communion asked women to literally replace the symbols of store-bought beauty with the symbol of the beauty and power of women's solidarity. It's a pretty cool history for this ritual. Water's a wonderfully flexible metaphor. I'm grateful for that, having written 10 homilies on it over the years. As I looked into this first water communion, I was interested to find not just how they did it, but what it symbolized for these women. For the most part, this gathering of women focused on water as a common source of life. They celebrated the primordial waters of the earth in which life first began to come together. And they spoke of the absolute necessity of water in our daily lives. They celebrated water as a symbol of the amniotic fluids, the waters in which we each are nurtured into life. For those first creators of this beloved ritual, water represented the commonality of the source. We come from the same source. It's a very simple way of describing universalism, the fact that we're all in this together. Our mission as a Universalist community is pretty simple too. Our mission is to live in deep recognition of that commonality. I used to not think that was enough. I used to think that we needed to be grounded in our history and know all the details of our past. More and more, I'm realizing that simply recognizing our commonality and living into that bold reality is plenty of mission for a lifetime. I began writing this sermon earlier this week in a waiting room in Santa Ana at the ICE office, at the immigration office. It's not a huge waiting room. There were probably 20 other people that came and went over the course of the hour we were there. They came from all different regions of the world. A few of them were young children, and I imagine the stories and backgrounds were quite different. I don't know what brought them to the United States, but I did know that all of us in that room felt a sort of shared vulnerability. Everyone in that room was in the same boat, hoping to build a life, grateful for having gotten this far, and uncertain of what would come next. A handful of us have been in that ICE waiting room, not everyone though. But you've almost certainly spent time in a hospital. This may sound strange, but that waiting room sort of reminded me of a hospital. Fortunately, I haven't spent a lot of time in hospitals. The only night I have spent in one was as an on-call chaplain. Being there with the job of caring for the whole hospital gave a different perspective from being a patient or a family member. Being there overnight and knowing that people were dying that night and people were being born that night. Having met several of the patients and their families, the hospital became an incredibly sacred space. The shared vulnerability and hope was truly palpable. Just like waiting in the immigration office, everyone is sort of in the same boat. The individual circumstances are different, yet everyone is seeking a little bit of comfort, wholeness, and courage. In those moments of common need, it becomes so clear how connected we are. In some moments, though, it's incredibly easy to forget. I used to think that as a faith tradition, we needed more than an open invitation to come whoever you are. But I'm learning that mission to build a beloved community, that calling to recognize our commonality is more than enough to keep any of us busy. In the next few weeks, we'll be holding another ritual for tapestry. It will be a perfect symbol, both of our mission of recognizing our commonality and our moving forward as a community. We're just days away from settling on a contract with a construction company. And I know, believe me, I know that this progress seems slow. But this week we've actually made a tremendous step forward. We're a breath away from signing on the dotted line to get the construction in motion. And as soon as the ink dries, in a couple of weeks, we'll celebrate with a wall-breaking ceremony. Yes, you heard that correctly. We'll hold a wall-breaking ceremony. Most people begin construction projects with a groundbreaking. We're going to do something that's much more fitting with our mission, though. We're going to ceremoniously begin life in our new building by breaking down walls. That's what we do, after all. We break down walls that divide us, walls that separate the haves from the have-nots. We tear down walls that close off our vision to what is possible, walls that close off our minds and our hearts to what is true. We'll begin our life in our new building by tearing down walls. And I couldn't imagine a better symbol for who we're called to be as a community. So that's a whole lot of talk about ritual and symbolism. But our symbols are only as good as the action that they inspire in our lives. Pouring water into a vessel doesn't make us any better. Knocking down some drywall with a sledgehammer doesn't make us any better. What makes us better is our willingness and our ability to settle into the truth of our commonality. So in the next few days, as you feel confused or perturbed by others, maybe it's just me that does that, or when you feel like you yourself aren't quite good enough, I invite you to remember today. Remember that we are all in it together. Remember that we're all looking for pretty similar things, right? Healing, hope, a little compassion. Remember that each and every one of us came from the same source, no matter what false walls divide us. Amen.